Hi. About a month ago, I published a video showing people alternate ways to create the same effects as you would with expensive ND and polarizing filters, and generally, people really liked it. After all, these techniques, these digital techniques that I showed, can save you hundreds of dollars buying different filters. And filters generally degrade the quality, so you can almost always get better quality. But there were a lot of people who dissented, particularly people who had already invested in these filters and integrated them into their existing workflow, and they felt like those filters added something that couldn't be easily reproduced in post for free. So I wanted to readdress that. I put out a challenge. I said, send me your raw files. Send me one picture taken with a polarizing filter and one without, and we'll take a look. We'll see if there's something that's really worth capturing that is totally unique to a polarizing filter. So before I get into the polarizing filters and the challenge, I wanted to address the ND filters portion of that. ND filters, neutral density filters, basically block all the light coming into your camera, and in theory, they'll do it completely evenly, just giving you a slower shutter speed. So you can kind of get the effect of night photography, of those long exposures, but during the day in bright light. And you can do that to smooth the water in a waterfall, for example, and get that kind of feathery look. And I showed a completely free way to do this using multiple exposures and software. I wanted to address a couple of things. As I said in the video, for people shooting video, ND filters do have a unique purpose in that they allow you to get slower shutter speeds, smoother shutter speeds. And in fact, on this main camera here, we always use an ND filter so that the shutter speed isn't so fast that you see the refreshing on this screen. So definitely ND filters for video. There's often no other way, especially variable ND filters are really useful. People also pointed out, well, they have an 8-stop or a 10-stop ND filter, and to simulate that in software, you have to take a lot of shots. You have to take 2 to the power of the number of stops, number of shots. So if you wanted to simulate a 2-stop ND filter, it would be 2 to the second power, or 4 shots. Really easy to do. If you wanted to simulate a 3-stop ND filter, you'd take 8 shots, a 4-stop ND filter, 16 shots. All those pretty tangible. I think even 32 shots is fine, but if you wanted to simulate an 8-stop ND filter, you'd be taking 256 shots and combining them. And I totally agree. That gets to be unwieldy. At that point, it's certainly easier to put on an ND filter. I think if you just want to simulate a 3 or 4-stop ND filter, which is enough for most people, then I find it easier to just take 4, 8, 16 shots, whatever you need to do. So I just wanted to address it. Yes, as you get into really dense filters, it becomes easier to pull it out of your bag. Let's get into the polarizing filters now. I want to make one broad point about polarizing filters. Polarizing filters are unnatural. It's an unnatural effect. Your eyes do not have polarizing filters in front of them. It's a special effect. It blocks light in unnatural ways that look a little weird because it's not what our eyes see. And that's okay. I am fine with creating special effects to get great looking pictures, whether you do it before your camera captures it or after in post-processing. But make no mistake about it, polarizing filters create an unnatural effect, and that unnatural effect cannot be undone. The nice thing about doing it in post is you can always hit Control-Z and undo any changes you make. But with a polarizing filter, you can't ever back it out, and it will screw up some shots. One of the arguments people made is that polarizing filters can help you see through surfaces like glass or the top of water. And that's definitely true, and you cannot do that in post. If there's glare on the surface of water and you want to see through it, you can't back that out in post, really. But my argument was, how often do you need to do that? Because I personally shot with polarizing filters religiously for about a decade before I went back and looked at my pictures and looked at a lot of before and after pictures when I would take a picture without the polarizing filter and be like, oh God, everybody told me I needed to put a polarizing filter on. I'd put it on. And I'd realize the before picture was actually better, especially once I got into doing a little bit of Lightroom and post-processing. And throughout my career, when I looked back, I couldn't find a single shot that was better with the polarizing filter. And that was actually usable. So how often do you actually shoot people through glass? How often are you taking pictures of fish through water where that picture is good and you would be doing something with it anyway? That's one of the things we're going to be testing. But yes, polarizing filters do that. It's unique. You can't do it in post-processing. Same thing with cutting glare on leaves in landscape photos. That's a point that people brought up a lot. Leaves tend to have a waxy surface on them, and they will reflect the highlights from the sun. again, that's the way our eyes see it. It's totally natural. That is the way the world exists. Polarizing filters artificially cut that glare, and they can make it look a little weird, but maybe that's the effect you want, and it also can't really be done in post. We have some examples that will highlight this really well, so we'll take a look at exactly what it does. Let's jump into Lightroom and see the examples. I'm going through every single example that people sent. So just don't think that I'm like picking out the examples that prove my point. I'm totally open to it, and in fact, I want you to look at the pictures and decide for yourself whether it's worth the 80 or 100 bucks to get a good polarizing filter, or whether you'd rather just use the post-processing techniques that I'll show you. Let's jump into the first picture here. This one isn't a proper before and after. The photographer used a polarizing filter for this shot, and then he went back and kind of got a before and after example. So you can see there's a couple of kids here looking into a koi pond, and you can see the kids and you can see the koi. And it's not, the storytelling here isn't necessarily obvious unless you do kind of zoom in tight like this. But without the polarizing filter, the fish definitely wouldn't have been as visible. And I actually think we need to kind of raise the exposure a little bit just to make this a little more obvious. So here's the photographer's before and after, and that's with and without the polarizing filter. And here the difference is really, really obvious. Here, you really can't see the fish, and here you really can see the fish. Of course, this is what your eye would actually see, which is the bright sky reflecting off the water and mostly blocking the fish. This is natural, and this is kind of an unnatural look where the polarizing filter is cutting that glare and allowing you to see the fish. Now, there's no post-processing that I'm going to be able to do to completely reveal the fish. I can bring down the highlights, and I could probably up the clarity a little bit, the vibrance. Let's see. What if we try the dehaze tool? Is pretty useful for these kinds of things. Bring up the dehaze some. So now the fish, if you look at just this part of the picture, the fish are definitely more visible than in the original edit, but there's still no way I'm going to completely cut through the glare. So if this is what you want to do, and it's worth 80 or 100 bucks, you should invest in a polarizing filter. I will say in my entire career, especially even as a wildlife photographer, I've never once taken a picture that I wanted to do anything with where it was a picture of fish through the surface of water. I do a lot of underwater photography, and that's where you're going to get decent picture of fish. But even with a polarizing filter, like what then? You're going to sell it, or you're going to put it in your portfolio? What makes it worth the investment and carrying around that polarizing filter and pulling it out? But if you decide that's what you want to do, then you should get a polarizing filter. Here's another example taken by a different photographer. We have the before and after, and it's really easy for me to know which one's taken with the polarizer because the polarizer will always have the slower shutter speed. This is at 1/80th of a second. This is at 1/160th of a second. So that also tells me how the photographer had it adjusted, because you can turn a polarizing filter to different places where it'll block more or less light. So in this particular case, the polarizing filter is blocking one stop of light. And we can see quite a few differences in the before and after here. The before picture, well, they're exposed differently for some reason. The camera gave this one an extra 1/60th of a second, but it's still underexposed. Like, look at the histogram here. We can just see it's too dark. So I'll at least get the foreground exposures matched in post-processing so that it's a fair fight to begin with. So now the camera kind of exposed them the same. And let's look at the surface of the water here. Here we see the water is reflecting the sky, which is what water does. It looks nice and blue. And as we look at it with the polarizing filter, the water is much darker. It also doesn't have that nice gleam to it. And to my eye, I definitely prefer the water here. It's brighter, and it feels better because that is what your eye sees. It's a little weird here that the grass is so much brighter than the water. But there are some other things that are worse in the unpolarized filter picture. Like, let's zoom in here. That's a little too much. Let's look at the mountain here versus here. And we can see without the polarizing filter, the mountain has a kind of a blue tint to it. It's also a little bit hazy. Without the polarizing filter, it appears warmer and it's less hazy. And sorry, with the polarizing filter, it's warmer and less hazy. And the reason for that is that the polarizing filter is blocking some of that light, basically the haze. It's water vapor in the air that's reflecting particularly the blue wavelengths of light over to the camera, and that's giving everything in the world a little bit of a blue tint. This is what your eye sees. This is just, it's natural. So the polarizing effect here is unnatural, but if it's more pleasing, then I'm okay with that. So the first thing I'll do is I'm just going to match the color, because this is something that's really easy to do. So I'll just drag that slider over and just warm it up a little, remove some of that haze. Okay, so now the color temperature is about the same. With the polarizing filter, still has a little more pop to it. So let's just use the dehaze slider down here. I'll just bring back some of that pop. Okay, so now we have about the same color temperature and about the same amount of contrast in the foreground subject. And you can see one of the arguments I got for polarizing filters is I'd rather put on a polarizing filter than spend hours editing on my workstation. And that did not take hours. It's literally a couple of clicks. And in fact, I have a preset saved, which simulates a polarizing filter, and I just click it, and it will kind of do these things for me. But it's not a big deal. So as we look at these two pictures, the water is still different. The sky is a little bit different. Here the sky is a little bit brighter. Here it's a little bit darker. And I think the sky here looks lovely. That's what your eye would have seen. But if you wanted the sky to be darker as it is in the polarized shot, then all you need to do is to scroll down and drag the luminance down a little bit. So let's just try to match that up. Okay, so this is the polarized shot. This is the unpolarized shot with a little bit of editing. And again, if you think the polarized shot without the editing is that much better, or if you hated all the time that I put into the editing, then spend the 80 or $100 and carry that polarizing filter around. If you felt it was okay, then maybe you can live without a polarizing filter. Let's look at another example, another Olympus shot. So this one's at half a second, and this is at 1/6 of a second, meaning this is the one that was taken without the polarizing filter. You always get faster shutter speeds when you take off that polarizing filter. Polarizing filters block all light, requiring you to use either a higher ISO or a slower shutter speed, and that can also negatively impact your image quality by allowing more motion in things like the grass or introducing camera shake or something else. But if you're working with a tripod on a still day, it's not a big deal. Again, the exposure here is pretty different. So here, everything's a little bit brighter, and here everything's a little darker. So I'll just raise the exposure here to match it. Click the wrong picture. Okay, so now the foreground exposure is about the same. And the first thing I want to point out is look at the water here. For me, the photographer clearly composed this water in the foreground to be a focal point, and that's without the polarizing filter. With the polarizing filter, we lose those reflections in the water. And to my eye, I like this much better. First, it's natural. It's what our eyes are used to seeing, so it feels good. But also, it adds more of a focal point because it's got that natural reflection. Without it, the water becomes very just flat and dark and almost kind of dead. Another difference here, with the polarizing filter, you can see the sky goes from white to very dark blue. And here, the sky is a much more natural, even gradient. So if I use the dropper tool here, I can see on the right, the blues are at 92%, so they're almost white. And over here, the blues are at 69%, 68%. So that's a pretty huge drop. If I use that dropper tool over here, we can see the blues are at 91% and then 90%. So just more scientific way to say, hey, the polarizing filter introduced a very unnatural and, to my eye, weird-looking gradient up here. But what if you just want that bluer sky? Because it is reducing the contrast, because we don't have any lighting on this hill here. It's very dark. The sky matches that brightness a little bit better. We can go back again and bring down the luminance on just the blues channel on the unpolarized picture. So I'll drag that down until, is that like 69%, I think. Let's drag it down to about the same level. So here we have with the polarizing filter and without the polarizing filter, but some editing. And I had to do some pretty extreme pulling on the blues to match the color, and I wouldn't even recommend that. But to my eye, this is still a much more natural gradient to the sky than this, because as I've said before, the polarizing filter does something unnatural. But maybe you significantly like that kind of odd gradient in the sky or some other aspect of the picture, get a polarizing filter. So here's another set of pictures. These aren't quite aligned perfectly. This is 2 stops slower than this one, so that means this picture is with the polarizing filter. This one's also a little underexposed, so I'm just going to match that exposure. Okay, now those are pretty close, and you know, I do see a difference. As before, this picture's a little bit warmer because the polarizing filter is cutting out that blue haze in the sky. This one's a little cooler. So if we wanted to simulate the polarizing filter, oops, wrong. I could bring up the white balance and just warm the picture up a little bit. So I'll match the warmth of the mountain. And the sky did get a little bit darker. So let's drop the luminance on the blue channel a little bit. And, you know, there you go. At this point, I don't see much difference. We could add a little bit of dehaze in just to bring some more of that contrast back and cancel out a little bit of that haze. Well, to my eye on those examples, I don't see much else. So let's look at the next example. Here we see a much more drastic difference in the sky. Here with the polarizing filter, the sky is a very dark blue. And here without the polarizing filter, it's much lighter. And again, we see some of the same things. The mountain needs to be dehazed some and warmed up. A little too much. So I'll back off that a little bit. And then if we wanted that kind of deep blue sky, I mean, this is the polarized sky. And you can see it ended up this kind of weird purple. And also there we see a big difference from the darkest parts over here at like 55% to the brighter parts here at over 60%. Then, you know, here we have 68% and here we have 69%, 68%. So there's really no kind of gradient in the sky, but the polarizing filter did introduce this where it's darker over here than it is over here. It also changed the tone of it. Like this is the original hue, and here we have almost like purple kind of unnatural hue to the sky. If that's what you want, you do have the option of, you know, dropping the luminance here. And I guess if you wanted a purple sky, you could even drag it over there a little bit. But I don't feel like those are necessary. I like the sky the way it was without the polarizing filter. There, I think without the polarizing filter, the shot was actually better. Here we have this kind of the same thing. This is obviously with the polarizing filter because we have more natural looking skies over here, but then kind of weird purple skies over here. We look at this shot, we see a much more even gradient to the sky, more like the way nature actually is. We can go through the same process, warm it up a little, dehaze it a little, and then as we look at with the polarizing filter and without, again, to my eye, I greatly prefer it without the polarizing filter because I hate seeing the real sky color and then seeing this weird purple sky color. And for my own landscape work, I would then go in and have to try to correct the weirdness that the polarizing filter did. I had a lot of people telling me, I showed off that odd gradient in the original video, and I had a lot of people telling me, you should only use a polarizing filter at like a 90-degree angle to a sun and never with a super wide angle lens. But that felt weird to me. Like, what am I gonna change my photo just so I can use the polarizing filter? Am I gonna seek out a different location where I need to use the super wide angle lens? I don't know. People get really fixated on using a particular piece of gear when it's not necessarily the best choice. With the polarizing filter and without. And here we can see we've almost completely lost the detail in the sky. And right away, unedited, with the polarizing filter definitely looks better because we can see the blue sky and those puffy white clouds. Let's see if we can just simulate it a little bit. See the shots here a little bit overexposed, but it's a raw file. So I feel like we could probably bring the highlights down some. And let's try dropping the blues some. Okay, so the camera did actually capture all that detail in the sky. We look at the picture with the polarizing filter and without. Now they have similar amounts of detail in the sky. We might also look at the waterfall itself. So if you look at the water, look at the water through here. And here it becomes just kind of very dark and flat. And if you look at the water here, without the polarizing filter, the water is reflecting the light from the sky, just like your eye would see. And to me, this looks not only more interesting, but more natural. And so I prefer the one without the polarizing filter. We have this kind of filled in because it more represents what we see in the real world. You'll also see that as you look at the grasses and the leaves here, the leaves are brighter here and they're darker here. So let's get rid of that color picker and just zoom in on the leaves a little bit. And so this is without the polarizing filter. And you can see just kind of natural specular highlights on the leaves. The sun will reflect off these waxy leaves and back at the camera, and that's, you know, exactly like what our eyes see. When you put a polarizing filter on, the color drops, it becomes artificially darker, and those specular highlights are kind of gone. So now the leaves, instead of being kind of dynamic and contrasty, they're much darker and flatter. And some people prefer that look. I will say, you're not going to exactly simulate that in post, but you can, if you wanted to drop the luminance and increase the saturation, you can get a similar effect. It actually needs to go up in saturation a little bit more. So I'm not doing anything fancy. I'm not trying to like select the leaves or spend a lot of time at it. I'm just adjusting the green channel. And you can see I pretty much simulated the effect, but I think it actually looks a little more natural because we do have more of those specular highlights that give our eye a clue as to the shape of things. It just adds more three-dimensional form to subjects when you have that extra contrast. So with the polarizing filter and without the polarizing filter and with a little bit of editing, and again, pick the one you want, but I prefer the one without the polarizing filter. Also look at these trees in the background. This is with the polarizing filter. You can see these trees all become very dark because the polarizing filter is killing those natural reflections. You come back over here, you actually see the more natural shape to it. You make your own decision. Okay, here we have a series of pictures. I'm just going to look at these two. The author took pictures with the polarizing filter at different rotations. So these three photos all have the polarizing filter turned on. You can see as you adjust it, you can dial the effect up or down. So this is with kind of extreme polarizing filter. We end up with very dark skies, but you don't have to do that. This is the one the photographer said was his favorite. So we'll compare it to the picture without the polarizing filter. And we can see a couple of differences. This one has more pop with the polarizing filter than without. And you can see especially why film photographers in an era before post-processing would prefer to use the polarizing filter because it does add that extra pop. So the first thing I'll do is go down to the dehaze and increase it a little and just try to simulate that pop. This one's a little bit darker now, so I'll increase the exposure a little bit. And as with the other photos, I have to warm it up a little to kind of cut that humidity in the air that the polarizing filter helped to cut. So these, I might have warmed it up a little too much. These are looking pretty similar. I think the photographer liked the darker blue sky. I feel like the blue sky here is unnaturally dark. It also has that kind of polarizer hue where things are pulled towards the purples a little more. And I like the more natural color here. But let's give it that kind of unnatural darkness that we get with the polarizing filter. It looks like a pretty close match, maybe a little bit further. So this is without the polarizing filter and with a touch of editing, and that's with the polarizing filter. At this point, I'm not seeing a huge difference. You know, there's a little bit of difference in the shadows. I didn't perfectly replicate the pictures, but I do feel like I got all the effects from it. And for me, the burden of proof is on the polarizing filter because you're asking me to spend $100 on something, remember to carry it with me everywhere, and then pull it out of my bag, take a minute to screw it on, take my picture, you know, adjust it perfectly, and then put it back in my bag. There's extra work in there. So for me, the polarizing filter, the effects need to be worthwhile. It needs to make all that worthwhile. And if I can get results that I'm happy with without it, then I'd rather live without it. That's my take on it anyway, especially when you consider how many shots a polarizing filter actually screws up. Here's another example that the same photographer sent in. And you can see without the polarizing filter and with the polarizing filter, we're seeing kind of the same things. Warm it up, dehaze it, and then drop the blues a little bit. Oh, even more. Yeah, he got a really dark sky with the polarizing filter on this one, and that's just not my favorite effect. It is unnatural, and your eye kind of knows it's unnatural when you look at it. It looks weird, but I pretty accurately simulated. This guy's so dark here. So if that's an effect you want, you can definitely do that. Otherwise, I don't really see a noteworthy difference. This last example is rather academic because this isn't a picture that anybody's going to put in their portfolio. And I specifically wanted shareable pictures. Felt like all the other pictures were pretty shareable. They were good quality pictures. This is like an example the photographer took just to prove a point about the waxiness and reflection on the leaves. So this is without the polarizing filter. As we zoom in here on these leaves, we see the specular highlights caused by the reflection of the sun. Shows the form of the individual leaves. It adds some level of drama to the picture because there's greater contrast between the deep shadows and these reflections. As we look at the picture with the polarizer, you can see those specular highlights are just gone. It's not quite as contrasty, but you do get more of the greens in there. See if I can get those pictures lined up a little better. So the specular highlights that the polarizing filter cuts, those reduce the amount of green that you see, even though they increase the contrast and drama in the picture. As before, we can provide some of that richness by dropping the luminance of the green channel and increasing the saturation. And depending on your patience level, you could mask it off. So we're never going to perfectly simulate what the polarizing filter did as far as cutting those specular highlights. You just won't. But you can get the same overall richness of color while keeping that sort of natural reflection. So that's all the examples that people sent in. I hope this helps you make a decision. For those of you who are using polarizing filters or ND filters, please understand, I'm not coming to your house and knocking them out of your hand. Do whatever works for you. I don't care. My goal is to provide people unlimited budgets the option to accomplish what they want, to get the pictures that they're happy with without having to spend extra money. This frees up their budget. You know, you can easily spend $300 or $400 on filters for all of your different lenses. Put that $300 or $400 towards some other lenses. Buy yourself a nicer tripod, or heck, buy yourself a plane ticket out to Glacier National Park and get yourself some better pictures. I'm just talking about what's the best bang for your buck. And looking through those examples, I personally didn't feel like anybody made the case that polarizing filters provide a good value for their expense in both cash and time and maintenance. If you feel otherwise, you can write a comment down below, and by all means go buy that polarizing filter. I understand a lot of you, it might just be a matter of you do what works for you. Back in the film day, I always used polarizing filters, and often I would be happy with the results, but I didn't necessarily have the option of doing this type of post-processing. I believe in teaching a modern workflow that relies on modern digital tools. If you want to learn more about photography, certainly there are a lot of things that will make more of a difference than buying more gear, like mastering lighting, composition, posing, expression, storytelling, mood. These are all covered in our books, like Stunning Digital Photography, there behind me, which you can buy at Amazon. Search for my name, Tony Northrup, or visit sdp.io/store, and you can buy them directly from us. We also have books on Lightroom and Photoshop, so you can learn how to do some of that post-processing. Trust me, it doesn't have to take forever. If you check out my original polarizing filters video, I even showed you how you could use free tools to do those things. So no, you don't have to spend money on Lightroom or Photoshop. Share it with your friends, subscribe. Thank you very much. Thanks for everybody who sent pictures in. See ya.